frost flowers. And so if you haven't heard about those, they're absolutely beautiful. I've only seen them one time in the time that we've lived on the lake, but they're a really special topic. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Hike and Hearth TV. Today, we have quite an unusual episode for you. So if you've been following our previous episodes, you know that we've talked an awful lot about bird watching and birding for the last 3 episodes in a row. Today, we're going to talk more about winter ecosystems and habitat. The special focus is going to be ice. Yeah, we're doing a whole episode just on ice. So this is an idea that came about from Dustin. So Dustin, can you kind of give us a quick little introduction and let us know why did you think this would be an interesting topic? And what is it about our life that has made us such experts on winter ice?
Well, most people are rightfully afraid of ice conditions on lakes and rivers, and that's a healthy fear, right? But when the ice is safe and when the ice coverage is substantial on the lake, it's really a unique way to enjoy the environment. And after we lived here for a couple of years, I started to get in tune with the cycle of the way that the ice forms and started to get in tune with how ice is structured as it freezes and when it's safe, when it's not safe, what the different factors are you have to be in tune with. And not only that, I started to see every year people that were exploring the ice, unsafely on the first couple of days that it was frozen, going straight out to the middle of the lake, teenagers, people with no safety equipment, sometimes not even wearing hats or gloves. And it made me concerned that people didn't know what they were getting into. So that led me to sort of more intentionally measure the ice and use Facebook to broadcast to our neighborhood contacts what ice conditions I was observing so that people could make a more fully informed decision about what ice was safe for them.
Dustin, where I first want to start is with the ice report. And so for those of you watching or listening who don't know what I'm talking about, again, we have a Facebook group for our neighborhood, and it started a number of years ago where Dustin got into this habit of going out onto the ice in the winter months and evaluating it for safety and then posting his observations onto this Facebook group. And that is a community tradition at this point. Before we get into how you make that evaluation, can you kind of walk us through what the process is for how ice freezes on the lake? And I'm going to preface this by saying there's a particular book that Dustin showed me with this information on it. And at first, I really didn't get it because I was like, okay, yeah, we all know how ice freezes. Like it gets cold and water turns into a solid. But it's actually a really unique process for how ice forms and how it engages with the environment on a lake. Isn't that right?
That's right. The book is called Winter World from an author named Bernd Heinrich, and he is a professor at the University of Vermont, but also has a winter place up in Vermont where he's taken the opportunity to observe a number of different species and how they employ different strategies in order to survive. And at the beginning of the book, he really points out the process for how ice forms, which if you think about it, is really rather unique, right? Because everyone sort of knows that you drill a hole into the ice to go ice fishing and the top is frozen ice, but below that there's water. But if you think about the pure physics of how that happens, it's really actually a special process because if the whole lake froze as a solid chunk of ice all the way down to the bottom, the fish would freeze, all the life would freeze. It would just be this big solid block of ice, and it might never melt until the next year. So it's really important that lakes don't freeze that way, and it's unique in the chemistry of it. So everybody kind of knows that when you go swimming, right, you might feel a warm layer of water in the top 4, 5, 6 feet. But if you get your feet down nice and low, you can feel the cold water down there, right? And it's really refreshing in the summertime. So lakes naturally create layers in the water column where the deeper layers in the summertime are colder water. And that's because at different temperatures, the density of water actually changes a little bit. So colder water sinks and warmer water rises to the top. And that's the normal layering structure that we see in a lake. But at the end of the summer, as the fall nights start to get cold and the nighttime temperatures start to dip below the water temperatures, so, maybe around 60, 65 degrees, something like that, what happens is that warmer surface water starts to cool from the cooler air temperature, and therefore it gets more dense and it starts to sink down to the bottom. And then those cooler layers that were at the bottom all summer long are now less dense than the cooled water that just sunk down there, so it starts to come up. So in that way, the water column starts to turn over, and all of the colder water comes up. It's now become the warmer water, and all the warmer water has sunk down to the bottom to become cooler water. And that process happens until the temperature of the water gets to about 37 degrees, because at that point, it reaches its maximum density, and it stops getting dense as the water cools. So then once the lake reaches a uniform 37 degrees, now we're talking, in our area, December, mid-December, the whole lake is like 37 degrees. And then the air temperatures at that time of year are cool enough to start supporting ice formation on that first layer of ice. So when that happens, all that 37 degree layer, 37 degree water below any ice layer on the top, that's then insulating, and ice is a pretty good insulator. So the ice starts to grow, but the water below the ice really maintains that 37 degrees, except for the water that's right up against the underside of the ice, and that's how the ice starts to grow thicker from the surface downward. But it's that process of turning over that really allows the lake to stay unfrozen at depth and thicken on the surface to support weight.
Excellent.
And at the end, because ice is, as everyone knows, less dense, right? It floats inside your beverage because it is less dense than the liquid that it's in. The top layer of ice is also floating on top of the lake. So there's a buoyancy effect supporting your weight and the strength of the ice supporting your weight when it's thick enough to do so.
All right. So let's get into your ice report that you do in our neighborhood. You've been doing it for so long. I can't even recall how this happened that you just decided to provide this public service to our local area. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, there's nothing official about this, right? I want to make it clear. There's no such thing as 100% safe ice, right? Everybody has to make their own risk decisions about when to access it. But in the beginning, I recall the local fire department going out at the beginning of the season and sort of telling people that it was thick enough to ice skate at the town beach where the water's shallow and there's very little risk of anything disastrous happening, even if you fell through the ice because it's only, 2 or 3 feet deep at the town beach area. But at some point, the fire department decided that they, were going to stop doing that. And I understand nothing is official. And whenever I do my ice reports, I make sure everyone understands that they're assuming their own risk for accessing the ice. But I wanted to be sure people understood not just what the average thickness of the ice was, but where the soft spots were, where the higher flow areas were, the places to stay away from. Even when most of the lake is frozen, there's always a couple of places that can be sketchy. So it's really important to know sort of how the ice works, but also the topography of the lake below the ice, as well as the flows of your particular body of water.
Okay. So how do you go about this process? Actually, before we even get into that, I do want to say that one of the cool things about living on a small lake or any lake whatsoever that I think is fascinating is usually once a year or so, our local fire department will park down at our town beach. And they will go out there and they will practice ice rescues. And if you ever have the opportunity to see that, it's absolutely extraordinary. Like the process that they have, you'll see them put the ladders out onto the ice. They will break the ice and have someone get into the water so that they can practice that rescue. It really is extraordinary. So that's my little side note on that. And I thank our local fire department for taking the time to practice that and keep us safe within our local community. Now, I know that you do this and that you post every day, but quite frankly, I don't entirely pay attention to how you evaluate the ice. So, what is your process when you go out there for evaluating for thickness and safety?
Yeah, I do post pretty much every day when the conditions are changing rapidly so that folks have an idea of what the conditions are. But once they settle in, every day isn't really necessary. But it's important, and here's a good place to pop up the graphic that shows the different ice strengths for different thicknesses and the loads that they'll support, because people like different activities on the ice, like ice fishing, cross-country skiing, ice skating, snowshoeing, snowmobiling. And in the far north, people use ice houses and drive their trucks out. And in Alaska, there's like the ice road highway across, right? We're not talking about any of those extreme things, but it's important to know what thickness is out there that makes it safe to access on foot for the first time, and how the ice grows. So it's really important to measure daily when the ice is growing, because, you know, you really don't ever want to be on ice less than 2 inches thick. And 2 inches does not sound like a lot, correct? But there's different types of ice and different strengths. So the best ice is the really black, clear glass ice. When it's really cold out and that ice first forms, it looks scary because it's clear glass, but that's the strongest ice there is because there's no air bubbles in it.
So the air bubbles are what make it that cloudy white color?
Yes.
So, okay, so I'm thinking about that. Does that mean that, so I know ice is to a certain extent porous, but does that make it like, it's almost like a sponge, right? Or it's more of a open matrix? Is that why it's cloudy?
It is when it has nearly melted and then refrozen, right?
Okay.
So just because it's cloudy doesn't mean it's weak ice.
Right.
But 2 inches of cloudy ice is definitely weaker than 2 inches of clear black ice.
Got it. Okay.
Right? So
how do you go about evaluating the ice?
yeah, so
For the report itself?
yep. So first is visual, right? I go down to the dock and I have a look and I touch it and see if the ice moves when I press on it, or else I'll like keep most of my weight on the dock, but really press down with my foot on the ice to see if there's any waviness, right? And when you get to that 2 inch area, pressing down doesn't create any cracking. It feels like a solid floor, just like the hardwood floor under our feet right now. Once that happens, I start to drill, and from the dock, I'll drill and see if we've got 2 inches. If we've got 2 inches, maybe I'll step off the dock and stand right next to the dock and see. And if there's any cracking that happens, I'll jump right back onto the dock. And cracking is a natural process. So part of this video too will show you what ice sounds like as it's groaning and cracking and making a really cool like pew 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 sound, which is really fun to hear, especially at night. Sometimes I'll crack the window just to hear the ice groaning all night. It's really cool. But unhealthy ice cracks in a circle around you before it goes down. So if you ever see ice cracking in a circle around you, that's an oh shit moment, right? It's time to skedaddle out of there. And it's disconcerting if you step on the ice and a crack forms and like makes a beeline away from you. But that's actually a more healthy crack, right? That it's sort of going away from you. It's not terribly structurally impactful. And then, of course, when the ice is really strong, it's not going to crack at all from your stepping in a location. It might crack from growing and groaning now and then as you move around, but it's not cracking under you. And any crack where you see water coming up through the crack is a wet crack. Those are dangerous. Oftentimes, you'll see cracks that are purely dry, and that's a sign of good, healthy, strong ice, right? That's a normal process.
So do you check the ice from multiple locations around the lake, or are you just like, how far away from our dock are you going when you do that evaluation?
Yeah, I usually start by working my way out and maybe drilling every 15 or 20 feet until I have a sense. And the lake doesn't always form all of the ice at the same time. Sometimes on one night, the whole lake freezes all the way across and kind of locks in around the shore and stops moving around. But sometimes it freezes halfway out one day, and then that ring ice will get thick over a few days, but it might not close in the rest of the lake until later. So it depends on the observations I'm seeing. This year, we had a pretty good layer of ring ice for about 100 feet from shore at our end of the lake, but it took 4 or 5 more days until most of the rest of the lake froze.
I noticed with some of the drone footage that you shot checking out the ice this year that there were some depressions in the ice that we thought are probably from the Canada geese sleeping in that area the night before.
Yeah,
it was absolutely adorable. You could see like their little depressions in the ice. Okay, so let's move on and talk a little bit about our community within our neighborhood, because I feel like over the years we've gotten more and more engagement on the ice report. In fact, I know that there are a few neighbors who have started to offer up information to you from time to time. Can you talk a little bit about how that has helped this little community service along in our neighborhood?
Yeah, the ice fishermen are always the leading edge because they're drilling all the time, and they're going out drilling a big hole, and they're also well prepared with gear and stuff. But once the ice fishermen are out, then it's a pretty good sign that you can start exploring a little bit more. But it's hard to explore the whole lake. So now that I started doing the ice report, sometimes the ice fishermen in the neighborhood will add to it and give the public kind of an update on what they've seen. And other neighbors that might be, on the other end of the lake will text me and say, hey, it's 5 inches down here, it's still looking good, or it's a little thicker down here than what you measured, that kind of thing. And you start to get a feel for the way the thickness spreads. And for the most part, the lake is pretty uniform in the way that the ice grows once it's closed in. But sometimes there are spots that don't close in as quickly as the rest of the lake, and those are the ones to watch out for. Additionally, marsh areas and the swampy areas, this is a little bit counterintuitive because you think, oh, it's shallow water, it probably gets really cold and freezes better. But actually it doesn't. The marsh and the swamp has a lot of decaying organic material in the water. It's like an underwater compost pile. And in the wintertime, if you're familiar with how compost piles work, they often are steaming because the aerobic breakdown process is creating heat and methane gas output and stuff like that that's rising up. That happens in the swamp too. So oftentimes, especially as the lake is freezing, you'll see a layer of fog just over the swamp from that process because it's warmer than the rest of the lake. So always take special caution around the swampy areas.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about one of the topics that is likely to be something that most people are going to want to hear about, and that is wildlife observations when you're on the lake. Because although it seems really quiet in the wintertime, if you're passing a lake and it's covered in ice, the truth of the matter is, if you're really paying attention, there's an awful lot of clues out there that will tell you what's going on the lake.
Yeah, I'm going to plug the book once again. This is a book that I read that really got me in tune with the wildlife on the lake called Winter World by Bernd Heinrich. And it does a really good job of exploring the different strategies that different animals have to survive the winter. So frogs and turtles burrow themselves down into the mud and literally slow their metabolisms down and go into a state of kind of torpor, where they are able to live without taking a fresh breath of air for months at a time until the ice abates and they can come out and warm up in the sun again because they're cold-blooded, of course. Other animals like fish are perfectly fine down in that 37-degree water we talked about. And when the ice first starts to form, you often can see the fish right through the ice much better than you can when the water is unfrozen because it's like a glass, right? It's like looking into an aquarium instead of looking through the surface of the water. And when the ice first freezes, I have video of turtles, swimming under the ice before they had gone into the mud for the season. And then, of course, beavers and muskrats, which they do not hibernate, contrary to popular belief, but they do gather food and make big caches of food to eat over the winter that they can access from below the ice. So both muskrat lodges and beaver lodges come up above the surface of the water, but they're covered in sticks, and then they have an access inside their lodge down under the water somewhere else to get out, and they make caches of food in places where they can get to it from under the water all winter long so that they can sustain themselves. So their activity level goes down when the ice is heavy, but they're under there just snoozing the winter away for the most part. So that's the stuff under and around the ice, but also, especially when there's some snow, ice is a really good way to see the tracks of the other land mammals that are now venturing out on the ice. So it's a good place to go see coyote tracks, fox tracks, raccoons, skunks, those sorts of things, even mice, or even snow fleas, so to speak, or little bugs that you often can see on the water, which are pretty cool to come across as well. And the ice changes the whole habitat, so it makes it different for birding than the rest of the year. So it almost changes what was a wetland habitat with wetland specialist birds into a grassland habitat. And now the edges of the lake are more commonly frequented by owls and things like merlins and other grassland birds that might try to get their talons on a field mouse or something that's out on the lake. Our cat looks like he's about to jump over to the desk.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're going to have a visitor in a few minutes because he is certainly eyeing the setup that we got going right now. And our daughter is out with her friends, and this is her cat. So he's a little lonely right now. All right. So thanks for walking us through the wildlife observations. I will say I love that when we're out wandering around on the ice in the wintertime and you get to see little tracks or sometimes even channels in the ice that have formed.
I forgot about the otters. So otters are really difficult to see during the regular part of the year because there's Kitty.
Sorry,
because they're
guys.
secretive and they're really only out, before daybreak. But in the wintertime, you often can see their slides in the snow or any holes that they left from accessing the ice when they could. In addition to that, it's really great to see often owl wing prints in the snow because the owls will sort of dive at a mouse and leave their prints in the snow, which is really cool to see.
In general, have you noticed any changes in our ice season over the years?
Yeah, so our lake used to actually be used for harvesting ice in the times before electric refrigeration was a thing. So there's actually some boulders on the other side of the lake with anchors in them that were used to place a pulley and pull in blocks of ice. And when I heard that, I realized that, geez, that must have been a worthwhile commercial operation, even though when we moved here in 2004, some ice seasons were really good from like mid-December to maybe March 1st or maybe even a little bit later. But other ice seasons, there was practically no safe time on the ice, which made me realize that ice operation must have been relying on a much longer season than we have now. And in the early 2000s, or mid to late 2000s, the first 5 years or so that we lived here, it seemed like most years the lake froze between Christmas and New Year's. That it wasn't like clockwork. You couldn't totally count on it, but that was the guidance. And then some years were a little bit later. And then that's crept later and later. We tend now to see the ice not form until January 10th or 20th, or sometimes it forms lightly and completely goes away and then comes back by late January. And some years we have much shorter seasons. I think last year we really only had good ice for like 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. So it is a lot more variable, even just in the last 2 decades. Certainly within our lifetimes, we're seeing the impacts of climate change.
Okay. So we talked about my first topic, that's my favorite, which is wildlife. I want to talk about the next topic. You already alluded to it earlier in the vodcast when we were talking about the sounds that the lake makes. And I will tell you There's one sound in particular that we hear every year on the lake, and it's my absolute favorite. And it's when the ice is expanding and you hear this pew pew, and it like echoes across the ice. And I swear, it sounds like you're in a scene in Star Wars where the stormtroopers are shooting at Chewbacca. Like, it's that same sound. Why does that happen? Why do we hear these sounds on the ice? Have you investigated that to figure that out?
Yeah, the short answer is that sound waves travel at different speeds through different medium. So when the ice makes a sound, whether it's a cracking sound or a grinding sound against itself, some of that sound travels downward into the water and is traveling at one speed through the water and is traveling at a faster speed through the solidness of the ice. Think about how differently something sounds. If you're underwater and you snap your fingers, it sounds very different. Or think about when you were like a kid in elementary school and you put your ear down to the desk because the work was over. You could tap on your desk and hear it very differently because the sound waves travel. And so that pew pew sound is a result of those sound waves transitioning kind of, or you're hearing it in both, traveling through both substances. And also some of the sound waves are kind of going in and out of the ice to the water a little bit too. So that's why you get that unique sound.
I don't know the proper term for this. So I'm just going to say the ecosystem of a lake. And what I mean by that is what I have learned over the years of living on a small lake is that you have to pay attention to the dynamics of the water body that you're thinking about going onto when you're talking about walking on the ice, because just the way that body of water functions determines how safe that ice is going to be and for how long it's safe. So could you start by just giving a quick overview for the audience on what that structure or dynamics are of our lake as far as the depth and water flow and all of that?
Yeah. So moving water doesn't usually freeze, right? It has to be really cold for a waterfall to freeze. It has to be really cold for the ocean to freeze. Yes, there's salinity of the water that it lowers the freezing point as well. But also for rivers with flowing water, those tend not to freeze either, unless it gets really cold. But when you have water that's still enough and temperatures low enough, the freezing starts to happen. So it's really important to know the flows of your lake or your body of water. In our case, there's a few natural springs. I know where those locations are. And there's a bunch of kind of water runoff storm drains that come in. And so I know there's actually one of those on either side of our house. And those come in together and they flow towards one another kind of around our dock. So oftentimes our dock has thinner ice than a lot of the rest of the lake because of that. Additionally, you have to kind of know where the outflows are, and I know where the outflows into the marshes are, and those both freeze later and thinner than any other time. So it's important to steer clear of those areas, and you know, I do a good job of that.
All right. So I think it's time for us to talk about probably the most important topic in the podcast, which is ice safety tips. Yeah. So let's start with, I don't know. Why don't you just decide where you want to start? How about that?
Let's start conservatively. I said it before, but there's no such thing as 100% safe ice, right? Even if there's lots of people out there, stuff can happen. So no one should go beyond their comfort zone. And no one should pressure someone else to go beyond that person's comfort zone. Let's start there. Then, if you're not comfortable, wait until you see ice fishermen or other people skating, and you'll start to see where, is accessible. And if you know the depth of the water body that you're at, go cautiously and skate over places that you know to be shallow. You know, it would be cold and unpleasant if you went through waist up to your went through ice up to your waist, but it wouldn't be disastrous. If you were only in knee or waist deep water, not only would it be, you know, probably not life threatening, but it would also probably be easy enough to, you know, jump and get yourself out of the water pretty quickly too. But it's important to know how to dress and prepare accordingly. So I mentioned earlier these safety spikes, which are a good tool to have with you. These are made so that if you need to, they're made to wear around your neck, but so that you could stick them into the ice, and there's a retractable spike in here. So this retractable spike allows you to get some purchase on the ice. But most importantly is if you ever do have let me go back. It's really important to have a plan no matter what. Then if you do have an emergency, you're not making your plan up as you go. You're putting into action the safety plan that you already thought through, which is an important step.
All right. So I guess, you know, what do you love about winter on a lake? What's your favorite things about being, you know, we all talk about, a lot of people talk about their love of summer and swimming on a lake or in the ocean or whatever. But are there things in particular about the winter months that you love in those environments?
Yeah, I mean, I love that there's generally fewer people on the trails, fewer people on the lake. The air is, you know, still and silent and quiet, especially at night. I spent some time on the ice at night this week shooting the Mars eclipse where the moon, Mars passed behind the moon, which was fun. And in those moments, right, it's unique. It's unlike any other time of year. So it's really fun. And as a birder and someone who likes to watch the animals that are around, it's really neat to see animals behaving differently and seeing their tracks where they're going. And it allows me to get to parts of the lake that I can't at other times. There's a few marshy areas that I might be able to paddle into early in the spring before they get overgrown. But there's other areas that are pretty darn near impossible to get into. But when the ice is really well frozen, it's really fun to skate back in the marshes and around the little islands and stuff in there that I just can't get to the rest of the year. So that part's really fun.
No, I agree with all of that. And what I'll also add that I have appreciated and enjoyed about going out on frozen lakes in the winter is there's something about it that I just feel like when I'm out there with my friends or my family, we seem to slow down a little bit. You know, yes, there's snowshoeing and cross country skiing and skating and whatnot. But I do find that I've had more moments of just kind of hanging around a small hibachi, like talking to the ice fishermen about the day, watching the kids run around on the ice and slide all over the place, and talking to our neighbors and our friends about absolutely nothing in particular. And there's just a stillness to it, even when you're being active, that I enjoy. I also personally love that feeling of the sun on your face if it's a beautiful sunny day, because that just feels like such a treasure in the wintertime that, you know, I think we take for granted in the summer months when it's hot out. So that's really it for me.
Yeah, the winter days are short, right? So
Yeah.
often we're out there just as the sun is going down and we're trying to get the last few minutes of daylight. There is one thing we alluded to, but we didn't really go deep on, which was the phenomena a couple years ago of frost flowers. So we'll show you now what the frost flowers look like. It was just about almost 2 years ago now to the day. It was early February, and we were forecast to have temperatures dropping down into about 15 degrees below zero, which is extraordinarily cold for suburban Massachusetts. The night before this happened, it was very, very windy. And although the temperatures were in the high teens to mid 20s, maybe, it was so windy that the whole lake was open water. None of it was frozen at all when it got dark on that Friday night. The following morning, we woke up and I saw this. And I knew it hadn't snowed, and I was intrigued by what had happened because not only had the whole lake frozen, I have to go back and see, it froze like an inch and a half in a single night, which was crazy. But also, these little ice crystals were covering the whole lake, and I knew it hadn't snowed. And those ice crystals were not on the grass or the street or the house or the steps or anything. They were just on the lake. And so it got me interested in researching about this phenomena until I learned that they were frost flowers. And this phenomena of frost flowers happens on lakes when the temperature drops really suddenly and has just a little bit of wind. What happens, or what happened in this case, is the ice froze first, and then the temperature differential from the water below the ice and the ice itself was so much warmer than the super cold air that was about 12 degrees below zero that night, that it created water vapor like steam rising off of the ice. And that steam got far enough off of the ice into the super cooled air that it immediately crystallized into those crystals that then settled all over the lake.
Yeah, they're really, really beautiful. If you have the opportunity to see them, we're definitely, there's some photography we've put up.
Yeah, there's very few places in the world where frost flowers are known to regularly occur on a freezing lake because most places slowly get cold and then stay cold. But there are a few places, I think in Japan and in Siberia, where there's some warmer water that it can be subject to this. And of course, it can happen anywhere. But when we saw this, it was the only time I've seen that in now over 20 years living on the lake. So I recognize it as being really special, even though I didn't know what it is. And that is what has kept me curious throughout my life in wildlife and conservation. So I'll just remind our friends to keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.